Welcome, everyone. This is Sean Patrick Hazlett from Through a Glass Darkly.
This is Jack Connor from Cosmic Road.
And today we're doing a joint episode on the strange phenomena that is out there right now, particularly with what's going on with all this UFO, U.A.P. disclosure stuff. So the first thing that we want to talk about is I recently published an episode about a Gary Nolan interview about the potential for some whistleblowers to come out and start disclosing a little bit more information. And there was some actually interesting disclosures about the provenance of the famous Wilson memo. And then for folks who were living under a rock or unfamiliar with the Wilson memo, Jack, if you could explain that, and then what was the revelation that you may have heard, but now it's kind of solid and in stone?
Sure. Well, I researched this a lot when it first came out, say a year ago. Some of the details have slipped my mind, so please fill in the gaps. But yeah, the provenance of this is coming from astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who's a very interesting fellow and a very positive influence on research into the phenomenon. And he did some really interesting stuff. We could talk about that later.
Well, I mean, number one, he was an astronaut.
He was an astronaut, absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
And but he investigated near-death experiences. He compiled statistics on alien abductions. I think it was his research that led us to understand that 30% of all alien abductees are also near-death experiencers, which is huge. So there's a huge crossover between the metaphysical consciousness, spiritual stuff, and the alien stuff. So, and we owe that to him. So I really admire him a lot. But yeah, so these documents are coming from him. He had custody of them. I think they were given to him, I want to say, but this is coming from a conversation where Stephen Greer and Admiral
Wilson. It was Eric Davis and Admiral Wilson.
Yeah, Eric Davis. That's the name I was blanking on. Okay, so there was a what is his rank? What is Admiral Wilson's rank?
So at the time of the memo was written, he was assistant director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the equivalent of the CIA for the Department of Defense. And he ultimately became the director of DIA, which, because he decided not to push the issue you're about to discuss, is how he's able to achieve that.
Okay. Well, Dr. Stephen Greer, who, I have some issues with, but not on this issue. He has briefed several presidents on the UFO phenomenon, which is why I take exception to some of the stuff he says, because he knows better. But, So, like he says alien abductions don't exist. Yeah, okay. All right. But yeah, so from I believe the conversation that Eric Davis had with Stephen Greer, and how did, because it's been a year since I've researched it, how did Admiral Wilson see this conversation? Did Eric Davis give him the notes that he had taken on this conversation? Remember how that happened?
So there was a meeting with Admiral Wilson and Eric Davis in Nevada at, I believe, some aerospace company.
Now, was this with Stephen Greer?
No, this now, as far as I know, it was just Eric Davis, Dr. Eric Davis, and the Admiral Wilson, and there was like a driver, obviously, and they were discussing this special access program that when he was assistant secretary of defense, assistant director of the DIA, he became aware of a crash retrieval program. And initially he thought, oh, okay, well, I'm not read into this, but I need to be read into it because, if we have a crash retrieval program, I need to know more about it. And he heard things kind of in the background about UFO crash retrievals, but he's a very conventional man, very, conventional military officer. He's like, oh yeah, that's just a cover for like Soviet and Chinese craft. But it's under my purview because I'm running like a number 2 in like the Army's intelligence agent, the military's intelligence agency. So like I need to know about these special access programs. So again, and he's in this memo, Eric Davis is just writing notes of the interaction because, Admiral Wilson is just talking to him about this thing that he went through when he was at DIA. So he starts asking questions and people start getting nervous and he gets a phone call. So Admiral Wilson gets a phone call. So he goes to, he has a meeting. I can't recall where it was. It might, I don't recall where the physical meeting was, likely in Washington. And there's like 3 people who show up. There's a security manager, who's like a counterintelligence type guy. There's a corporate attorney. And then there's someone else. I can't recall off the top of my head. But there's 3 people who show up, but they're not really military people. And he's like, what is this? Like, I'm hearing. And during the course of the conversation, it becomes apparent that there's a crash retrieval program, that we've recovered, non-human craft, and that we also have something called alien reproduction vehicles, or ARVs, which are reverse engineered vehicles that we've tested. And these people represent an aerospace defense company. Now, he's just like, okay, well, like I need to be read on the program. And the response he gets back is like, well, you do satisfy almost all the criteria, but you don't satisfy all of it. So I'm sorry, you can't be read in. He's just like, excuse me? So he's like, let me see a list of like who's read in on this program. So they show him a list, and there's almost no politicians on it. There are a very low number of military personnel on it. The rest of them are like corporate types. So, he's furious. He raises the issue with the Special Access Program Office Coordinator, which is the back before this, Secretary Perry reorganized the naming of these SAPs because they get out of hand really fast, right? Especially if you talk to anybody who's ever been on an SAP. So I've had interviews with David Morehouse, and there's actually a clip called Black Book that you can look at about how these things work. But there's probably actually more in private conversations. But when there's a congressional inquiry on a special access program, the people running the special access program, don't really respect Congress. I mean, do you respect Congress?
No.
So they have that attitude, but it's like, on methamphetamine, right? So what they do is they'll seed them a little bit of the information, but they won't seed them the core of the information. It'll be just enough to make the congressperson go away. So that's what they were kind of doing. They're trying to manage. Admiral Wilson is irate because he's just like, what the F? I'm like the assistant director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I coordinate all intelligence for the Department of Defense, and I can't have access to like a program that is under my purview, black and white, no gray areas. And like, yep, nope, sorry. So he raises it with this SAPOC, right? This committee, and by the way, this is the story that he's relating to Eric Davis. So they come back with them and say, you know what, like, if you really want to make director of the DIA, you'll let this one go. So we let it go. So why would a corporation be controlling a program like this? Well, it's pretty obvious, right? If you want to keep a secret for 80 years, again, I'm speculating because I don't, Roswell may or may not have happened, et cetera, right? But again, like I'm trying to be neutral. But if you want to keep a secret, right? Because that's really not the point. If you want to keep something super secret, and you have these like Freedom of Information Act requests, the easiest way to circumvent it is to deep six it into a corporation where, like, it's a private company. The public has no right to proprietary material, non-public information of that corporation, unless they're stockholders. And even then,
yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. And that has been long the rumor that a lot of the Area 51 stuff, the breakaway group, has moved out of the government into the private sector precisely to keep it hidden. That seems to have occurred, decades ago. That is interesting because Lou Elizondo, very famous for E.T.s, who really kind of got the ball rolling on this. Well, he didn't get paid for his job at E.T.s. That was a side gig. His day job, one of his day jobs, was doing security for special access programs and making sure people were not able to get into them. And so he
or the information disclosed, i.e., counterintelligence.
Sure. Yeah, that was exactly. Good thinking. So he had access to a wide range. He says all. I mean, I don't know if it was all, but he was like, I have access to all the special access programs. I was able to see what they were doing and know this stuff was not in any of them. So he categorically says, no, it's not, a secret space fleet or whatever, the breakaway group, whatever you want to, whatever there is not officially government. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I'm sure there are some special access programs that are sub programs or whatever that can stay hidden, even from someone like him. But I firmly believe that it has gone private, much of it, at least on paper.
So Stephen Greer had a theory on this, and I'm actually inclined to believe it because it somewhat tracks with what I've been told from people who've actually been in special access programs. So in the military, in the intelligence business, there's, kind of your normal, operations and things like that they might be secret, but they're not black ops. Right. So, you can be a head of the DIA if you've been like a tactical military intelligence guy who's been on aircraft carriers, and your goal is to assess what the Chinese are going to do and how many aircraft they have in their carriers and what the state of those craft are and what the likelihood they're going to do X, Y, or Z. And then there's the black ops people who are running things like strategic like disinformation campaigns, right? So campaigns that are like 10 years long. I'll give you one example. So there was a gentleman that I spoke to who, during the 80s, the Soviets had anthrax and we didn't have a cure, right? You just had to get the vaccine or you're in trouble. But they had these anthrax antidote pills. So he's in this office with this one colleague, and another colleague walks in and is just like, oh man, I got a horrible headache, Bob. Can you give me one of those pills? So he throws over somebody like this anthrax antidote. This guy pops it open, pops 2 pills. He's like, thanks, and walks out. And this gentleman who talked about this thing is just, he looks at Bob, who, again, I'm making the name up. And he's just like, Bob, what the F? why is he taking anthrax antidote? Isn't that dangerous? He's just like, aspirin. So there's these, they do these large, and there's a number of things that they do that can be borderline. So another example is using the Mormon Church to infiltrate operatives with folks doing their mission in Central America, right? They did do that in the 80s. So that's a black ops. So there's people who grow up in those programs who for 20, 30 years have been proven to keep a secret. If there's anyone in the military who gets pulled into these sorts of programs, it would be those people, not the Admiral Wilsons of the world. And I that is kind of Greer's theory, and it does feel like it tracks, but I don't know. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just to give some context.
No, you have researched this more freshly than I have, and I really appreciate that. So many of the details have been lost in my spongy brain. Once I put something with some more information in there, the other information goes out.
But the one thing I didn't know, right? Because I didn't know that the Wilson memo was real. Okay, like I didn't know what its provenance was, but the fact that Edgar Mitchell, when he died, he had it in his effects, so no one even leaked it. It was just somebody was going through his stuff, and they're like, "What's this?" Mm-hmm. And Eric Davis has not come out and said one thing or another.
No, and Admiral Wilson himself has said that it is bunk, and there's a whole bunch of people that have chimed in on it one way or another. And some of them say, no, it's absolutely legit. This happened. And some people say, no, it's total bunk. So, it's a kind of a flip a coin, whichever way you want to lean, you can find an argument for or against it. I have found enough to make it very solid for me. I firmly believe that the Wilson leak is legit, and that this really happened. And it makes perfect sense that it does. But I am somebody that believes in, Roswell, and, that the government has been heavily involved in this and suppressing it for a long time. So I'm inclined to believe they would do that. And it makes sense to me that they would. But to others, it probably doesn't track as well.
Yeah, for me, I'm of the perspective that I don't know, but I'm very open to learning more, because a lot of this tracks in terms of, if after fighting a devastating world war that killed well over 50 million people, something is in your skies that could wipe out everything on the planet, or this has technology that could wipe out everything on the planet. At the same time, you're starting this terrifying Cold War with the Soviet Union. I could see at that time, if I were a policymaker, if I were like a Vandiver Bush or like a Admiral Forrestal, I would be hesitant to like just add even more paranoia to the American plate. Because the other thing too is the Soviets also, I think, had programs where they were using the fear of UFOs to, and not only that, like you also had the War of the Worlds phenomena where people just freaked out. So like that would have been fresh in your mind about how the population might react to it. So I can understand potentially there being a rationale for it. And then add on to the fact that, God forbid, if we even, if we ever recovered these craft, and there are many indications that we have, from, to your point, Roswell to the Bob Lazar stories.
Roswell wasn't the first.
Right. There's there's like a 1936 Black Forest.
Yeah.
I think it's one
potentially earlier than that. There was one newspaper that recorded. They didn't have a word for UFO at the time, but there was a downed weird saucer of some sort in like 1907, and that they retracted. The newspaper retracted the next day. And
you also have the miracle of Fatima, right? Was it really the sun dancing in the sky?
Right. Of course, that could have been more of a metaphysical thing. That could have been some sort of, extra dimensional event that happened, or consciousness event that happened. But that does seem to be a real event of some sort. I think the government has been suppressing this for a long time, at least since the early 1900s. And that is where my research has led me. And it was, if we want to get really kooky about it and out there, I love the giants. I love the giant thing, right?
The CTK, right?
Yeah. So I don't know CTK. What is CTK?
So there were, throughout there's the mounds, right? As an example, throughout like the Native American burial mounds. There's also, I want to say in like Loveland, I can't remember the name of the town in Utah, in Nevada, where they found these like giant bones. There's there's views that the Smithsonian used to have
They did.
these.
You can see pictures of.
This, yeah, I mean, I've heard both sides. Like I've heard, like, I think National Geographic has been trying its damnedest to like suppress what they consider disinformation about this thing. Like it's a hoax. I haven't investigated the phenomena to really know. There's another apocryphal story called have you heard the Giant of Kandahar story?
Yes, yes. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's
You're the military guy. You give me your perspective on that.
I've talked to a lot of people in Afghanistan. It's yes, it's not real.
It sounded too juicy to be true.
Yeah, it's a great story. Like I would love it to be true.
Yeah,
And they're always very specific about like the 6 fingers and the 6 toes and
but there's only like 3 witnesses that have come forward about it. Witnesses.
Yeah, one of them's like an Air Force guy that claims he
Right,
like transported the body or.
But the phenomenon of the giant seems to be a real deal, and it was very mainstream back in the day. There were all sorts of newspaper articles about people finding giant bones, and these weren't misidentified mammoth bones or something of that order, or dinosaur, because there were the skulls, the human-shaped skulls. And but it was fairly mainstream, like I say. There were at least 2 New York Times articles about people finding giant bones. So this was very mainstream. It was, well, I wouldn't say because it was commonplace, but it happened every now and then. And then in the early 1900s, somebody worldwide cracked down on this topic, and you stop seeing these reports. I think the latest one was in the 19-teens, but pretty much by the first decade of the 1900s, they petered out. And that's right when that first story of the government forcing this newspaper to retract this UFO story occurred. So that's where my research has led me to believe that the government has been involved in this in some capacity, whether it's just to prevent hysteria or to control the narrative, or if they've actually actively been involved in dealing with the beings. That's been for at least 100 years in one shape or another.
So what do you think, based on what you've read and studied, what do you think is really going on behind the scenes?
God, I don't know. I really don't know, but I do believe that the government is involved in it. I have studied countless UFO abduction stories where the abductees have seen government officials and military people working with the beings. Now that seems to be separate from the actual MILABs or military abductions. And
just for people who don't understand what MILABs are, just really quick, what are they for the viewers?
Well, those are when people get abducted in a very alien abduction way, even to the point of having their memories wiped and having to recover these memories through a regression hypnosis. So it just mimics the alien abduction phenomenon almost to a T, but they're dealing with military guys. And when they are regressed, what they often experience is that the military guys are trying to get them, because these are alien abductees that have been kidnapped by the military, and the military seems to be trying to find out what the aliens are doing, which is fascinating if that's true, and it seems to be, because there's so many cases that get so many details congruent with each other. So if the other stories about sometimes by the same people are true, that the aliens are working with the government, that means there is one faction that is not involved in that is trying to find out what the other faction is doing. There's one faction that is involved with the beings and one faction that is not. And it may, so maybe the faction that is not is the one that is reverse engineering technology on their own. They have some recovered craft or material, and they've been able to develop, the Aurora or whatever, whatever experimental black ops ship they have that has non-mundane exotic technology. And then there is the Area 51 and breakaway group that is actually actively working with the beings. So then there's one step beyond that, and that's all the secret space fleet stuff that I can't quite make myself believe. But the more I've researched it, I've seen a lot of evidence for it, but you also see evidence for the giant of Kandahar. So, yeah. So, but yeah, I do believe that some faction of the government or somebody that used to be in the government, like we were saying, maybe it's all in the private sector now, or largely, at least on paper, in the private sector. Somebody in an official capacity is working with the beings, and probably has been for a while.
Yeah, so I don't have like a strong narrative around this. It's more of a range of possibilities. So the most mundane of these, anybody who says that there aren't, or that the sightings that people have experienced aren't real, i.e., like the intelligently or apparently intelligently controlled objects with the Nimitz videos and the Roosevelt videos, like the Neil deGrasse Tyson view that it's all, like, I think he's wronger than a football bat on that. Like, he's just, there are things in our skies that we don't know what they are. Like, that is 100% that appeared to operate in an intelligent manner. I think while there's a debate on it, I think the evidence is overwhelming at this point. So at a minimum, our government is aware of this phenomena, but they have no idea what it is. Therefore, if you have no idea what it is and you're running a national security state, right, and you're sucking up $700 billion of taxpayer money every year, the last thing that you want to do is come out to the public and say, hey guys, we've been observing these things since the dawn of human civilization. We don't know what they are, but there are some people who claim that they come into their households and abduct them and experiment on them and then drop them back into the population. We see cattle mutilations. We have no idea what they're doing. We can't stop them, but we think they mean us no harm. Right? Good luck. Right? Like imagine trying to write that speech for a U.S. president. Right? Like, so that's the most mundane explanation that I can come up with. That's perfectly plausible. On the other extreme, you can go with the whole, you can, again, I'm not endorsing either view, but I'm open to a wide variety of different possibilities. On the other extreme, Roswell happened. We recovered alien technology. We took the craft, we parsed it out to various companies to extract as much technology as we can. Some of the technology that we were able to intuit from that, we may not have been able to reverse engineer it, but it may have given us ideas ranging from the transistor to the night vision to any number of different technologies. And the rationale for keeping it quiet is that, again, in the Cold War time period, if you have access to highly exotic technology, you don't want the Soviets to know about it. You don't want the Soviets to know who's even working on the program, because they're going to start targeting their family. They're going to start trying to steal the secrets, just like they did with the Rosenbergs, right? When they stole the atomic secrets and things like that, because this is a secret that is far above and beyond that. And in the same extreme, right? Maybe we've made contact, and maybe we are working with certain elements of whatever species are out there, because there might not be, there's probably more than one. If the diversity of Earth and the species on Earth is any indication, if you're talking about trillions of stars that have been around in a universe that's 13.5 billion years old, right? It's almost a certainty that another civilization has developed, hundreds, millions, even billions of years longer than we've been around. We've only been on this planet this planet's only been in existence for 4.5 billion years, right? So there's 2/3 of the time, in the universe, 2/3 to 3/4 of the time in the universe, our planet wasn't even here. So, imagine if we're working with those species, but we're not working with other governments. There's an incentive to try to achieve technological breakthroughs as much as possible before the other guys can. If you listen to Ross Cothart, he's actually indicated that the Chinese have been very aggressive about going after anybody who they even have a whiff of is associated with some of these projects, poisoning them, doing all sorts of things like that, which if you're the Chinese, you would absolutely do that, because this is an existential, think about it. If we were to develop this technology, there would be no one on earth who could oppose us. No one. Full stop. Same thing with the Chinese. If they got to it first, we would absolutely murder people to keep this thing in our hands. Well, and that's actually, I'd like to hear, because I have suggested that, but without evidence, right? Like if you wanted to keep something quiet, like at Roswell, did anybody disappear?
There was one guy that died mysteriously after being pressured by the Men in Black, because the Men in Black existed at that time. But government agents that were trying to suppress this information just went throughout the town telling people not to talk about this, or we'll, kill you and your family. And there was one guy that did die mysteriously who refused to comply. So, I'm not saying he was definitely murdered by the government, but there have been so many of those throughout the years, especially people who have looked into the deep underground military bases in the secret space fleet stuff, which is the only reason I take that stuff seriously, is that somebody's taking that seriously, and there is evidence that people have suicided. Multiple people, many people have committed suicide.
So here's an example I've always wondered. So to your point, and you probably know more about this than I do, how familiar are you with the Majestic 12?
Fairly. I'm not an expert on it.
Do you know who the Majestic 12 were? Like which individuals?
Was Vannevar Bush one of them?
I think so.
Yes, so. And of course, the man that died, who
Admiral Forrestal.
Yeah, Forrestal.
Yeah, he suicided. He jumped out of a window.
Exactly. So he was one of those who suicided.
And my understanding, like the story I heard long before I started following the UFO phenomena, was that he was so stressed out by the Cold War that, he, with like the burden of preventing thermonuclear war, that he did that. But the more you think about it, like maybe he, look, I would be concerned if I were in that position, but I wouldn't kill myself. However, like if I knew something else that fundamentally challenged the nature of what I perceived to be my own reality, right? Or my view was like, we need to tell the world that these things exist, and we need to start changing things so that we can accommodate the new conception of ourselves in the universe. I think we should disclose it. And the other members saying, no, and then killing him, right? That's also a possibility.
Well, Forrestal was a really accomplished guy. He was a really impressive figure. It's been a minute since I've researched him. Again, I hate to forget this knowledge, but I remember being extremely impressed by him when I was researching him. And he doesn't seem like somebody who would cave under pressure or stress, who would commit suicide under stress.
Yeah, he was a defense secretary, right?
Right, exactly. So, a heroic figure, really. Would he have committed suicide because he was under a lot of stress, or is it more likely that he was suicided? There's different stories, different versions of the story about how he could have been killed, and one that he was really unhappy with suppressing this information, and he wanted to go public with it. Another was that he heard what had happened with Admiral Byrd in the Antarctic.
Yeah. What's that? That sounds like a crazy story. Is that high jump?
That's high jump.
Yeah. Explain to folks, because even I'm like really
Okay,
I don't
well,
know that too
there's
well.
different versions of the story. There's I've heard like 4 or 5 different versions of the story, and I'm not going to say that one of them is the absolute what happened. But yeah, immediately after World War II, the U.S. government sent, I think, 2 fleets of warships into the Antarctic to deal with the Germans that had established a base there. The Nazis that had established I don't know if I can say that word on YouTube. You may have to take that.
What the Germans or the other one?
The Nazi word. You know, for a while.
I think it was called like Neue Schwabenland or something like that. I mean,
Okay.
they definitely had an area allocated to them.
So they had a research area that we know, but they wouldn't have sent 2 fleets of warships to deal with that. And they seemingly came back defeated somehow. And Admiral Byrd was saying that we need to prepare, that the U.S. has to prepare, because there are now ships that can go, enemy ships that can go from the South Pole to the North Pole in seconds. So these highly advanced craft, and so we don't know a lot of concrete information. Other than that, there's a lot of rumors about wars or an actual military action against Germans who had alien technology. And the story is that the aliens had actually helped the Germans in the beginning of World War II and leading up to it. And they had helped them develop this technology. And then when they saw that they were going to misuse it, they withdrew their support, but they still had at least some of this technology, and they were trying to develop more on their own. And it wasn't until the end of the war, or even after the war, that they got their own flying UFO type ships and were able to maybe implement them in war. And that's who Admiral Byrd and his people fought.
Oh, I mean, so we've heard of pilots in World War II. U.S. pilots have reported the presence of Foo fighters, right? Which are effectively UFOs. So, and then we also talked at the very beginning about the 1936 Black Forest incident. So, do you think that's related to the German thing, and the objects that they saw in the sky, were they from a non-human source, or could they have been Germans?
I think that the Foo Fighters were from a non-human source. The Germans thought they were us. We thought the Foo Fighters were German secret craft. And at the end of the war, looking through all the documents, it does not appear that they were German. And since we didn't think they were ours, it's unlikely that they were ours, unless it was some super secret project, which is always possible.
Yeah, doubtful.
But doubtful. So yeah, I think that was the beings checking us out, monitoring what was going on, or something. I really don't know. Do you have any ideas? But I do think it was non-human.
I think this phenomena has been going on since the beginning of human civilization. I think this place has always been visited by something. And again, I'm not even suggesting that it's extraterrestrial. It could be extra dimensional. It could be demonic. It could be some force of nature that we're just not familiar with. It could be like radiation or electricity before we knew what radiation and electricity were. It could just be some natural phenomenon. But I am open to trying to understand whatever it is. And then there's also, if you look at historical, just fairy tales and things like that, there's always this reference on like elves and dwarves and like small beings and kobolds in Germany, and who came up from underground, and they could also be, what's the term, ultra terrestrial, right? They could be people living underground, subterranean, much larger, civilizations. I doubt it, but it's possible. Is it plausible? Probably not. So I think it's important to be open to this stuff. And I think as more people are coming out with the information, I think it's becoming a little bit more reasonable to talk about. That said, there's also a ton of disinformation out there, right? Which, again, this kind of off Earth space force thing. One of the things that I've heard is that like the NSA and the JSOC are like running it and this and that, but JSOC is like they only got beefed up in like the last decade, right? Like it just doesn't make any sense that this stuff would. I mean, as an example, I know a guy who used to be in Delta like way back in the 80s, and one of the questions I asked him, I'm like, did you ever recover like an alien craft? And he was just like, no. It's like, no, but there are missions that like where they would recover like Chinese craft and things like that, and or Soviet craft in foreign territories. Again, I don't know of any specific operations, but that would be more of a mission that they might be involved in. So, when you get into the specifics, that's when someone with my background can smell bullshit, right? But here's the other thing that makes me question at least some of the folks who've been very visible about this stuff. So recently, you have Lou Elizondo, right, who has a counterintelligence background, and then you have Travis Taylor, who's working on Skinwalker Ranch, while at the same time is employed by the Pentagon, right? I don't think that's an accident. I think he's there to gather information on behalf of both, and I also think that he may have a messaging role, i.e., if there's something that cuts a little close to classified information, steer these guys off a little bit. Like just point to something else and keep them going. As an example, if you recall the episode where they actually started making a ton of progress beneath the mesa was when he wasn't there. Remember that?
Yeah, I remember that. He was probably off working for the UAP task force at that point.
Yeah. Now, look, I'm not saying that's what's happening.
No. I'm just saying that may be what he was doing when he wasn't there. Yeah.
And the same thing with Lou Elizondo. Like, why is a counterintelligence guy the guy who's in charge of all this stuff? And I can think of a counter narrative for that. If you're trying to keep all these programs secret, right? The easiest way to expose leakers is to create a honeypot. And the honeypot is, hey, look at me. I'm Lou Elizondo. I'm famous, right? Hey, why don't you tell me your stories? Like, we can make you famous too. And the people who come to him and violate their national security oaths, he's got their ass, right? Because that's what counterintelligence people do. So I am not saying that's what he's doing, but I get suspicious when I see counterintelligence folks, because that's what their jobs are to do.
I just think it's too obvious to appoint a counterintelligence guy to do that. If he was a disinformation agent, they would, he wouldn't obviously be a counterintelligence agent. He would have some other official title or background. Maybe secretly he would have been a counterintelligence agent, but because it's so easy to point at Lou and say he was counterintelligence, so what he's saying is a lie. It's too easy to discredit him because of his background. So I find it hard to believe that they would choose someone of his background to spread that.
So what's worse? Having him just out in the open like that, or having someone just pull up his military records and seeing these in counterintel and saying, hey, this guy's a counterintel guy, right? Like, you lose credibility instantly. But now if there's like, hey, he's a counterintel guy.
I think these guys have the ability to fake IDs and to create a whole identity for somebody if they wanted to. So
That's 100. That's 100% true. Yeah, that's like they do have.
So yeah, so they
Yeah.
wouldn't. I don't think. To me, it doesn't make sense that they would have picked Lou as a counterintelligence officer to do this.
But what? But if he was a counterintelligence officer, why would he be working on this
Well,
sort of phenomena?
probably because he was already involved in secret access programs. He was managing their security. It was easy to pull him aside and say, "Hey, you're a straight guy. You're not a crazy UFO nut. You know, the last guy just left. You want to manage this portfolio for us." You know, and that's kind of how they pulled Travis Taylor into it. If we could talk about him for a moment, because I think that's a really interesting topic. You know, I love Skinwalker Ranch. That's really what, you know, opened me up to the weirder aspects of the phenomenon. Before then, I was just looking into UFOs. But Dr. Travis Taylor, when he first started, I mean, the story is, I mean, who knows what the truth is, but the story is, his version is that he was on his first season of working at Skinwalker Ranch for the show, that he picked up these weird signals. And even though he had done, you know, stuff involving the phenomenon before for like ancient aliens and stuff, he wasn't like a super, his go-to response wasn't that it's aliens. It was, this is a near-peer adversary doing something. These signals were picking up, there's somebody spying on us or somebody doing something. So because he had worked for the government, he had contacts in the Pentagon, so he went and he briefed those guys on what he was doing. So you could say he was spying on the show in the results of the experiment, even back then for the government, and he was briefing them on what was going on. And that's what got them interested in him, and eventually they appointed him as the chief scientist for the U.A.P. task force. Now, what makes me think that he's probably not too overt of an agent, I think that he's probably keeping them abreast of some stuff, but he doesn't.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but he doesn't direct the show. He doesn't direct the course of the investigation. Not that he couldn't conceal some stuff or misdirect some stuff, but and he might. But he did speak out against Bray and Moultrie, if I'm getting their names correctly, the two gentlemen that testified before Congress, that were, you know, spearheading the U.A.P. task force as the heads of the task force. They were not the ones analyzing the data.
This is the night vision goggle like pyramid thing.
Right.
Look, I've used night vision goggles. Like a drone on night vision goggles does not look like that.
Right, of course not.
It's complete BS. It's complete BS.
And there were many witnesses, and there were many of these objects, and this was over multiple days. And there weren't just the pyramids; there were also the spherical shapes that went into the water. And we have one of those videos that's been acknowledged by the Pentagon as the sphere going into the water. So, there were. This was a big event with many ships, and you know, in the water, in the air, the non-mundane ships and the mundane ships. To write this off as a drone is just patent misinformation by Bray and Moultrie, who did not receive that you know, classification from Dr. Travis Taylor as the chief scientist.
Now to be fair, for plausible deniability, whoever briefed them probably told them that, oh yeah, it's drones, here are the things, and well, like so they wouldn't be exposed and have to lie under oath.
So okay, well that could be, but don't you think that their chief scientist would have been in on the briefing?
Yeah, but I think the chief scientist would have been like, it's the, you know, would have just told them the lie, and they're like, are you sure? Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
well, but that was Travis Taylor. He says he did not.
So Travis Taylor briefed them before they went into the room.
I don't know if he briefed them or not, but he was their chief scientist.
Okay, yeah. So again, I don't know if I were running like an op like that, what I would do is I would take two useful idiots. I would provide them with fake information, and I would put a wedge between the people who actually have the right information and like filter it through a bunch of lackeys so that I wouldn't be putting somebody up in front of Congress to lie under oath, right? Because it's a federal crime. Like these people could do prison time if they lied. So I think what they were telling is what they were briefed privately. But I think what they were briefed privately is, as we talked about earlier with special access programs, there's really not many people in the Pentagon who are in the know, right?
Right. And so, we're talking about the breakaway group and whatever. It's not the mainstream government that's doing that.
I wouldn't even call them a breakaway group. I would just call them
that's Richard Nolan's term for it. That's kind of caught on. And I like.
Yeah, they're like people working in like black book projects, who, and corporate entities associated with them is what I would.
But they did. Well, but he calls them the breakaway civilization. Because they have this high technology that the rest of us don't have. It's like a separate civilization.
That feels a little like, to me, that feels a little incredulous, right? Like I do believe there are people working on these highly secret special access programs, and their loyalty to the Constitution is highly dubious. But a lot of this technology has been seeded into corporations who are solely focused on exploiting it for, maximizing shareholder value and monetary gain, and have more of an incentive for this information not to get out.
You think that's what's going on? I was thinking it was, to me, it was just being hidden in the private sector, but because they're the ones dealing with the beings. That's to me, it's just being hidden in the private sector. This breakaway group, I've pared it down from breakaway civilization. To me, that also sounds a little too fancy. So I've pared it down to great breakaway group, because they did start.
Well, I'm not saying like it's possible, but it sounds like it sounds like Crazy Town to me. But
I agree. Well, that's why I call it the breakaway group. Although he's a very level-headed guy. He's not a secret space fleet guy. He's not a. Anyway, we were talking about Travis Taylor. Let's finish that real quick.
Yeah, because I have a question for you that's like take us in a completely different direction. But we'll.
But just to finish my thought on Travis Taylor, he has spoken out against Bray and Moultrie, saying that he did not make that recommendation about the green pyramids. He did not tell them that was a drone. So the fact that he is going against the government narrative on this makes me trust him more. And so I don't think that he's necessarily misleading the effort at Skinwalker Ranch for that reason.
Yeah. And again, I don't know what to believe. I'm just spinning different potentials. So the other thing, let's take, like, we can go with the minimalist and the maximalist breakaway group kind of thesis, right? And I would say the maximalist is that there's like this, secret, separate government, this and that on the like extreme. And the way I think, if it's real, it's closer, is this: you have a group of corporations that have access to the technology, and then you have people who are working black projects / special access programs in the government who are kind of, who recruit people separately and have long-standing histories that stretch all the way back potentially to Roswell, if not before that. Okay. And, there might be 40 people. No, I think the Wilson memo said 400 to 800 people might have been on this special access roster. So the issue with that is what makes disclosure so difficult is not only what we talked about earlier, right? It's just admitting that we have a craft, like if it's that extreme, we have the issues with our adversaries, but also if you killed people to keep it quiet, right? You have that issue we talked about. The third issue is legal, which is, you mean to tell me the U.S. government seeded certain of this technology into certain companies, while other companies went bankrupt, who didn't have this technology, who couldn't compete. And how did, like, you have a massive lawsuit that stretches back 80 years for every company that's gone bankrupt. And it's just like, what the heck? Like, the government's choosing winners and losers? Are you nuts? So just imagine if you're like the president's counsel and you're thinking about having to untangle that. Like, what a nightmare that would be. And then the third thing is, again, if you take the extreme approach that we have all this technology and things like that, then you're talking about a massive displacement of entire industries. So the petrochemical industry, the utility industry. Let's say you've had 0 point energy for 80 years. Again, I'm just making this up, but people are going to be like, what the F?
Right.
Like,
right.
Right. So, and then the other piece is going to be, there might be a fundamental rejiggering or realignment of the way society is and the fundamental nature of reality, right? Like, if, kind of like the Protestant Reformation, right? You don't need a priest to talk directly to God, right?
Right.
It's the same thing. Like, I don't need a government.
I've used that same analogy before. Yeah, that's where we are.
Oh,
now.
really? I just made it up.
Yeah, no, that's the whole CE5 thing. We're dealing with the beings directly instead of going through the government to do it.
But you understand the government's perspective and how that can be
Yes.
extremely dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Because the presumption there is that everything in the universe that is more advanced is friendly, and they couldn't have possibly advanced if they were aggressive and this and that. And my view is there's a fundamental degree of balance required in the universe. There's always going to be predators and there's always going to be prey. And you're going to have some entities that are likely good and some that likely do not have human interests at heart. As an example, again, I don't know if I talked about Dr. Morehouse, who was a remote viewer in Project Stargate, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, Center Lane, Scan8, all those special access programs. And he worked in the the DIA, Department of Science and Technology, and he's a remote viewer. And they would do these project search outwards, where they would just go and try to find a technology in different quadrants or sub-quadrants, because the galaxies are massive, in different galaxies in the sky. And he said that they would find warlike civilizations, and he said particularly people who were who had, depending on what your background is, it would draw you to whatever that civilization was. And because he was, a Ranger company commander, he was, he was in the 82nd Airborne, he would always not always, but often got drawn to warlike civilizations because he was a warrior.
You resonated with that.
That's exactly what he would say. So he would see more of that, and others would see more peaceful civilizations. But at the end of the day, he said he saw some people, some that were inspiring and some that were just like dark. So the reason the government, again, I'm just putting my government hat on and trying to be empathetic, right? Would be, it's like giving a pistol to a monkey. Right? Like, for all you might call an invasion down on, again, I'm not saying that's going to happen. And maybe the way that this thing works is that you're only inviting positive entities and things like that. But their perspective is like some mutton chop out there might want to like give his wife breast cancer because she cheated on him. So she's going to call down some like malevolent entity, and they're going to do the job, and they're going to do something else, right? So I can understand why there would be a hesitancy. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying what I am saying is I have no idea.
Oh no, well, okay. Taking the positive approach on all this, that the government isn't keeping this secret for diabolical reasons, that they're doing this for us in a way. Okay, so there's a few ways that could go down, and one is to prevent mass hysteria, like the War of the Worlds, scenario, right? The other is also kind of what you're suggesting, giving a monkey to what was it? Giving a gun
Giving
to
a pistol, giving a pistol to a monkey.
right. So
in fact, there was a I got to read this because it was in the New York Times. There was a Ukrainian, I think he was like a nuclear engineer. He's talking about Zaporizhia, the Zaporizhia power plant that the Russians are currently at right now, which, by the way, is like there have been several occasions where shrapnel has hit some of their coolant vessels. You're not hearing it because our media is asleep at the switch, but you have to look for it. But there's a few incidents like that. But his quote in the New York Times was, I'm only giving half the quote. They are like a monkey with a grenade.
Yeah. Well,
anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I had to throw that.
No, I think that's exactly right, because that's the positive approach to all this. If the aliens are dealing with some faction or factions with the government or the private sector, and they have given people 0-point energy, for example, just imagine what we could do with 0-point energy. It would solve all our problems, and it could make all our problems. If we had unlimited power, just think of the unlimited destructive power we could have. So talk about, powering the world forever and doing all these magical things we could ever want to do with electricity and energy, but we could also blow up the planet.
Well, there's even more pedestrian problems with that. Like, how many people would be laid off? Right? Like you're in Texas, right?
Right.
Like how big's the petrochemical industry in Texas?
Energy is a big deal here.
So like all those people unemployed.
Well, but okay, so that's been the narrative or the story for a long time, that it's actually been the energy industry that has been suppressing this. That has been that for decades. People have said that they're really the ones behind the hits and the disappearances and the suicides, because they don't want this to get out there. They don't want this technology to come into the light. They're trying to keep it into the black sector because it would totally destroy this entire industry that is a huge industry. So I have no strong feelings on that one way or the other, but that is a possible scenario.
Yeah, and look, I'm not saying, like, I think it is prudent to include that consideration. That said, I don't think that's a sufficient excuse to deny that gift to humanity. However, you need, if it were to exist and you were to provide it to humanity, you would need to do it in stages so that you could manage the shift that it would require of the population. Because the last thing you want to do is like, hey guys, tomorrow, 0-point energy, y'all got it. We have a company that we just gave 100% to it. They have their monopoly, 100% market share. And yeah, we don't need those oil fields anymore. So I think you guys need, it's like the whole thing. It's like, well, you can learn to be software programmers. Just take a jobs training program. You'll be fine, right? Like that I think you have to manage in a way that doesn't cause, as you imagine, I don't know how many people it employs in Texas, but it's probably, I don't know, 10 to 30%. Imagine that many unemployed, right? Like I have friends who fought in Iraq and unemployment there was like 70%. Well, what happens there? Well, if you want to pay somebody to set a roadside bomb, hey, you can make a good day's labor just sticking this thing out before a U.S. convoy comes in. Like it is massively destabilizing to have an unemployment that's high. So before you do this, you have to have a plan. But the problem with our society is like our politicians change out so rapidly. You can't really be thoughtful about it unless you have like a military industrial complex behind the scenes to plan it, but they have no incentive to plan it because they want to keep the secret. Right. So it's like this catch-22. But again, this is all speculation.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm just trying to be thoughtful about, like, it would be a huge adjustment to bring this stuff out. So,
but then there's all the story. You can. Yeah. Well, all right. So the government's involvement in all of this, how deep does it go? Because there's all these stories about how as far back as Eisenhower or Truman, that the president has been making deals with the beings, with the aliens. Sometimes the story is they've made a deal with one race. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 races. Sometimes the story is he made a deal with 2 and denied making a deal with 1. And that's usually the Eisenhower story. And that's how our active involvement with the phenomenon began. With the people being abducted and seeing military officials there and government officials there, and the reverse engineered craft that Bob Lazar is said to have worked on.
Which some of those crafts were, quote unquote, according to him, recovered in archaeological digs.
Right? Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to see that Indiana Jones movie.
Well, I mean, that's what could be in that mesa at Skinwalker Ranch.
Absolutely, it totally could be. And that was just, there were, I think, 11 saucers that were at S4 that he was aware of.
I think it was 9. I think it was 9.
9. Okay, he was working on one of them, the sport model. But theoretically, that was only one place that we're storing these things. There have been talk about these things at Wright-Patterson, and if the stories about the deep underground military bases are true, then God knows what is there. But yeah, so the government's involvement with this is very questionable, and it could be going back a long ways at a very deep level, at least a faction or
well, another thing about Skinwalker Ranch that, like, just 2 or 3 kind of crazy comments, so just bear with me on this. So they keep talking about this 1.6 gigahertz signal, right? So like Iridium cell phones, right? What frequency they transmit on, right?
I'm guessing 1.6.
There's like a range, like again, we talked about this gap in a signal, but it's like 1.6 something to 1.6 something, right? But yeah, who uses Iridium cell phones, right?
Who?
The Combat Applications Group, CAG, the Delta Force. And how do I know that? Because there's a book by a former Delta operator where he just he talks about having I don't know if they still use it, but they were using it back as early as like 2005, something like that. So and they hear garbled stuff, but it still sounds like anything that the military would transmit it typically has frequency hopping capability, but if you're using a sat phone, you don't really necessarily need a frequency hop, but it would certainly have encryption. So, there's a chance that they're just, capturing, operatives talking to each other.
Do you think that that's what Travis Taylor heard? They made him think that the phenomenon at Skinwalker Ranch was from a near-peer adversary, and that's why he went to the Pentagon?
I don't know if it was that specifically, because like that's our own people, right? It could just be like the intelligence support activity, which is known as Gray Fox, Task Force Orange. They're like the intelligence folks. They're also people who did remote viewing back when they started as FOG and stuff like that. But they provide kind of similar capability to tier 1 special forces organizations like the CIA, right? So like it's like their version of the CIA.
So do you think there's another faction involved? Because we know there's a surveillance by some government entity being done at Skinwalker.
Yeah, the government is certainly surveilling. However, that's the other thing too with special access programs. So like the way that intelligence is compartmented, it could be multiple government agencies, right? So because in compartmented intelligence programs, a little bit, but you don't know the full picture. So there might be some groups that know a little bit about the phenomena. There might be some groups that know about specific, like anti-gravity, but they don't know about where it came from and things like that. So you might have elements of the CIA, the Air Force. Again, I'm just making this.
No, that's actually what Brandon Fugel himself said, as they had been trying to identify the planes that were surveilling the ranch, and they had come to the conclusion after studying this for years that the planes were coming from different government entities.
Huh.
That's fascinating to me. And there's, okay, so one thing that I think about a lot is the different government entities that are involved with this, because we've talked about the factions before, the My Labs versus the actual abductions, the alien abductions. And then you think of like the compartmentalization of the Army versus the Navy. I don't know if you've read, Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, where he talks about how they reverse engineered this technology or farmed it out to the private sector, and
Exactly.
ushered in the computer revolution and a bunch of other stuff. So Kevlar and fiber optics, and but he was an army man, and the material that he was farming out and his predecessors had been farming out were material the army had recovered from Roswell. Now this is an Air Force situation. They controlled Roswell, but somehow the army got
Well,
stuff. Okay, yeah.
here's the thing. So, um, I don't, I don't think the Air Force was established yet. It was the Army Air Corps
Okay,
during
okay,
Roswell.
that would make sense. That would make
Yeah.
sense.
So that's, I'd have to double check, which is actually interesting. The other timeline to look at is when the CIA, the NSA, and all these large organizations were first established. It was roughly during the same period. I think they passed like the National Security Act. So like sometime briefly after Roswell, you had the establishment of all these large intelligence apparati that seemed to come right after Roswell. And then, of course, you had Eisenhower's farewell speech warning about the danger of the growth of the military-industrial complex, which seemed to come out of nowhere, unless
Right.
you
He knew some
add
stuff.
the context to this, right?
Right. Well, to get back to Colonel Corso and the day after Roswell, so he talks about farming out this technology and the materials that they had access to that were recovered from Roswell, and it looks like they just had a few little trinkets and odds and ends. They did not have very much. So somebody had the full craft in the bodies, and that was not them. So was that the entity that the Air Force became? Because it looks
But
like
yeah,
some of the stuff went to Wright-Patterson at
right.
some point, and then it was probably went to Area 51 or somewhere like that. And so that's Air Force, even when it came into being. And the Area 51 didn't exist at the time of Roswell, but it became into being shortly thereafter. And I think it was, I want to say 1952 or something, but yeah.
Well, here's the interesting thing: like the Air Force has been completely mum on all this stuff. It's the Navy that's been
exactly, yeah. Okay,
right.
So this is where this is so fascinating to me, because like the Nimitz incident, so 2004, this is the biggest, most well-known incident. As soon as the pilots touched down on the ship, and they had their data bricks, I think they called them. It wasn't the pilots that got them, but the engineers or whoever got the data bricks off of the jets. Well, those they were seized by these two Air Force guys. So these Air Force guys showed up immediately on a Navy ship to seize Navy data bricks. So is there some sort of competition between the Navy and the Air Force? Somebody has something else, and maybe the Army has some other stuff.
Well, and now there's Space Force, right?
Now
Like
Space
that.
Force. Now we have another player in the game.
Yeah. So like, I don't know what's driving us. So I'm going to change the subject briefly because you said something on one of your shows that intrigued me, and I want to ask you more about it. So you said something to the effect of, and I don't want to misquote you, so please correct me. You said something to the effect of like in terms of the alien or the extraterrestrial or whatever you want to call like experiencers, there was a high percentage of Native Americans, Germans, and Irish. So like I know Gary Nolan is an experiencer. He's like half German, half Irish. I'm half German, half Irish. Like, tell me more. I'm intrigued.
Okay, well, again, I wish this was fresh in my mind. I wish this is something I've researched, a year ago. But yeah, so there are certain ethnic groups that get abducted more than others, and that is very fascinating. And the two ethnic groups that get abducted most are the Native Americans and the Scottish, if you can call it the Scottish, and if you can call that an ethnic group. And another group that has a deep association with the phenomenon is the Germans. The aliens like Germans. They like dealing with the Germans. I don't, you can read into that what you want. I have no clue what that's about. And Rh negative seems to be the blood type Rh negative seems to be very important. And there are some people that think that actually people with that blood type are actually alien or were created by the aliens. And there's all sorts of theories that aliens created us. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but if so, that goes doubly for the Rh negative guys who have more abilities, more psychic abilities than the run-of-the-mill population. I'm not Rh negative, so I don't have a dog in that fight. But that is fascinating, and I can't remember if the Native Americans or the Scottish have an above average incident of Rh negative blood. If somebody watching this, please research that and get back to me. And so, but yeah, so there are certain groups that get abducted more or have more involvement with the phenomenon or have more abilities than our average. And why that is, I would love to know. It kind of makes sense if the aliens did create these people or did design them, because that is one. It looks like people that are abducted by aliens or the beings, whatever you want to call them, the visitors. Whitley Strieber likes to call them the visitors. I don't like to call them the visitors because that assumes they are visiting and they could have been here forever.
Right.
But they seem to be abducted over the course of generations. If you're an abductee, one of your parents will probably have been an abductee, and your children are likely to be, one or more of your children are more likely to be an abductee. So they seem to be tweaking bloodlines over the course of generations. So why that is, I don't know. Why they specifically like the Scottish or the Native Americans, I don't know. You could theorize that they're closer to the earth, that maybe they're more spiritual. The Scottish, fairies and mysticism is, Native American, obviously very spiritual. So, I look at this all and recently, over the last couple of years, last 2 or 3 years, I've gotten into the whole spiritual metaphysical stuff as I've begun to have experiences myself. And now I have to believe that at least some of the beings come from higher dimensions. Whitley Strieber talks about that a lot. He says they are fissures in the stream of time, that they don't actually exist in our time stream. They come from outside of our reality and dip into our reality to pluck out a fish like him and do whatever they do. And then they put you back, but they don't live here. They live outside of our dimension or reality, whatever that is. So, so why are they tweaking bloodlines? Are they trying to get us to have more abilities and be more in tune with the higher dimensions? Because that is something that he and others talk about a lot. And that seems to be a real phenomenon, is that people that are abductees or contactees start to begin to develop psychic or spiritual abilities. They, can know stuff before it's going to happen. They can communicate sometimes mind to mind or read thoughts. They can heal with their hands without any training. It's just amazing the sorts of things that these guys can do. In one theory, and in fact, this is what some of them have been told. I don't know how much you can actually trust what the beings say, but I have made a study of studying what the beings tell people, because I, like to hope they have greater knowledge than I do. But how much can you trust what they're saying is the question. But they have told people they're teaching them these abilities, and they're as an exchange for what they are doing with these guys, whether that's taking genetic material to create hybrids, which seems to be a real thing. That may be too out there for some people. If so, I would refer you to the work of Bud Hopkins and Dr. David Jacobs. David Jacobs wrote an excellent and very creepy book called Walking Among Us, when he details, he has regressed thousands of alien abductees, thousands of abductees, and he has regressed each one multiple times, some many, many times, and has collated the information gathered from all these abductions. And over the years, they have gone from simply contributing genetic material with the aliens to actually getting to see the results of that and the creations of the hybrids. And now the hybrids have grown up, and they are now being taught to how to socialize in society. And they're being taught basic things like, the abductees who might be their parents will go over to where they are and teach them how to use the microwave, or teach them what a refrigerator is. They don't understand, why does food have to be refrigerated? So all these basic stupid things, and they can practice mind control. They can go to a store and just pick up a shirt and just walk out with it. They can just so if you read that book, you'll never sleep again. But it's not just him, but it is interesting that other researchers like Dolores Cannon has an entirely different take on alien abductions and what her people tell her. And that's what I talk about sometimes, is these silos of information. But I feel like I've gotten off of your question. So yeah, that's a whole bunch of stuff.